Danielle, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Very nice
That's
to
fine.
be here.
That's brilliant. That's fine. Now, Danielle. Now, as a typical dyslexia, it's Kingdom. Is that right? Did I say your last name correct?
Kingdon, yeah, with an N for
Kingdom.
November on the end.
And I'm
Yeah,
from
it's
November.
Kingdon.
Now, this
Yeah.
session is going to be a little bit different to all our last session. Well, over today we've had people with their own presentations, some people doing talks, some people doing videos. We're going to do a bit of a Q&A session today. Now, if people want to put questions in that chat box, please do that. Do this over the session, and what we'll do is we'll come to them questions at the end. But I've got a number of questions that that Danielle has sorted out for me. So I'm going to start now because we're now dead on 1 o'clock. So we're going to start the session now. So Danielle, could you tell me what? Could we start with explaining what is neurodiversity? What does this mean to you?
Sure. Well, neurodiversity refers to diversity of thought in human beings and how we all think differently. But the word has become associated with conditions such as autism, dyslexia, ADHD, dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome, and is used in the workplace within that particular context. So neurodiverse people normally have a bigger difference between what they're good at and what they find difficult, whereas what are termed neurotypicals have a smaller difference in their abilities. Neurodiversity is often referred to as the hidden disability, as it goes unacknowledged or supported, but it's thought that as many as 15 to 20% of the population are neurodiverse. And so I think everyone here listening will have either employees, customers, family members, and also I'm always very mindful that when people talk about neurodiverse people being on the spectrum, that you sort of have to question what neurotypical is, because arguably we're all on the spectrum. Some people might be extreme ends, some people in the middle, but hopefully that gives you just a general idea of certainly what is meant by neurodiversity within a sort of workplace context.
Yeah, it is really interesting for me, for someone that's worked in education for such a long time. Like originally, we never used the word dyslexia. It's SPLD. It's like a specific learning difference or difficulty. We had comorbidity. We had co-occurring differences, and neurodiversity kind of just sums it up better. I think that's a better word. So, moving on to that. So, how did you become involved in advising companies on neurodiversity?
Well, through a combination of working with some very forward-thinking clients who are sort of ahead of the curve, really, on neurodiversity, and also the personal experiences of those that I know and work with, and my general interest in sort of raising awareness faced by neurodiverse employees, I've just come to understand much more about neurodiversity in the workplace and its interaction with employers' legal duties under the Equality Act. I think the key discovery for me has been how very little change can have such a significant impact on the experience of employees and employers alike. So raising awareness amongst your management community, providing a voice and support systems for those needing help can be absolutely transformative. Within my own firm, we're taking our own steps to support neurodiversity. We've established a neurodiversity network, a group of people interested in supporting the neurodiverse population and who are either impacted personally or just motivated to drive inclusivity. And we're designing an intranet page. We've got various guest speakers that are coming to launch events. And also we're working with other Osborne Clark teams to just make sure that the experience from first contact on recruitment through day-to-day work experience enables our neurodiverse population to do their best work, and without sort of hurdles preventing them from doing so.
I think that's really useful. It's really interesting because, like, we know some of the large companies, and we've actually got Elliot, who's speaking next from HSBC, who is chair of their employer resource group in neurodiversity. So that's really interesting that you're doing the same thing. It's good. So, as you said, neurodiversity is an emerging area of diversity focus for many employees. What challenges does that pose for the it's a focus for the employer, what does it pose for the what does that pose for the employees?
Sure. Well, I think it's only been the last 5 years that the concept of neurodiversity has sort of crept into most employers' consciousness. But whilst neurodiverse employees have always been entitled to reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act, prior to this point, I think that most workplaces have only sort of recently woken up to their responsibilities under the Equality Act and introduced sort of neurodiversity training, policies, forums, adjustments to recruitment processes. It's sort of a little, I think a lot of employers are very late to the party, although the rights that the neurodiverse population would have had have been sort of entrenched for a long time under the law. But as I mentioned, neurodiversity is a hidden disability, and many neurodiverse employees struggle with challenges which are invisible to their employers. And so the impact of being dyslexic, dyspraxic, having ADHD or autism are often mistaken for conduct issues or poor performance or poor attitude. As you can imagine, that can result in many undesirable human resource issues, including grievances, conflict in teams, and ultimately employment tribunal claims if it gets so bad it goes to litigation.
That it's really interesting. I'm gonna just kind of just check something with you in my head before we move on to the next question. So we have we're going to talk more about the actual act later. Equality Act was which year? Is it 2010? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
And prior to that was the Disability Discrimination Act. Can you remember what year? Can you remember what year that came out? I can't remember from my head.
I think that was 1996.
Was it 96? Yeah. And that's what I thought. And there is definitely differences. So we're going to talk about that later. So that'll be good. So going on to your next question, we've got here is: are there any particular stages of an employer's relationship where problems can arise? You've kind of talked about a little bit about tribunals, but what are them problems that you could see and arise?
Yeah, I think that the neurodiverse employees, in my experience, when I've been advising in relation to issues, they're often they have quite successful coping mechanisms, and therefore the challenges that they are overcoming on a daily basis might not be overly apparent. So, for example, a dyslexic employee might be working longer hours to keep up with written reporting requirements, or an employee with autism could be struggling with the noise in the office, but just about coping with the sort of sensory overload. But it's often where there's change to the employee's work or work environment that the balance is tipped and the coping mechanisms they have been using are no longer enough. So just picking up the example of the dyslexic employee again, it might be that a change in manager requires additional or more frequent written reporting, and this means that they can no longer cope as they have done before, or that a change where you have an autistic employee who sits in a particular place in the office because they're trying to avoid sensory overload, but they're asked to move, and suddenly it becomes impossible for them to concentrate. So those are sorts of things that can crop up. Other stages in the employment relationship are promotion and being treated detrimentally, maybe change in duties, redundancies, reorganizations, or change in team dynamics can also raise problems. I think a common point for an employee's neurodiverse to be raised is when there's a performance or disciplinary process that's being initiated, or when an employee, a neurodiverse employee, raises a grievance. The employee might be reluctant to disclose that they're neurodiverse before this point, and they feel that they then have no choice when a challenge they face through being neurodiverse is impacting on a situation. So, and I'm happy to talk more about performance and disciplinary and grievance issues, because that's quite often the areas that I'm probably most advising on that create probably the most difficulties, I'd say, within the employment context.
Yeah, I think that it's very interesting to me, because going back to one of the roles that I did prior to working for myself, having difficulties with people not happy with how tidy my desk was very interesting, and the downside was my first desk was very much in the eyesight of when you walked into the office, and I had a delivery for an event of about 12 cardboard boxes, and they were all around my desk, and certain people wanted to move stuff, and I was like, no, don't touch anything, because it's all organised in that way. So, it fascinates me. It does as well, how people think and how that can actually really impact. So you got here. What is the position of an employee who raises that they are neurodiverse during that performance or discriminatory proceedings? So how does that feel?
Sure.
How does that work?
Well, I think, as I sort of mentioned, often employees are very reluctant to disclose that they're neurodiverse because they fear judgment or a lack of support or some other sort of negative response. And this is particularly the case in workplace cultures where there is no support system in place, such as visible inclusivity policies or support forums or awareness training for managers and employees. So when an employee raises that they think being neurodiverse is having an impact on the situation, they should be listened to very carefully and with a supportive and inquisitive mindset. It might be that an employee articulating difficulties, but not framing them within the context of a diagnosis of neurodiversity. And this is probably more common in older workers who, as understanding and diagnosis is becoming more and more commonplace in recent years, but maybe, older people don't even know themselves that they're neurodiverse, so don't even know to sort of raise that as an issue. But I think the really important point actually to get over is that you don't need a diagnosis in order to be protected under the Equality Act. And in my experience, actually, most managers want to support and find a solution to a problem, but they might struggle to know how to go about it. And they, of course, worry about saying the wrong thing. The starting point is always listening to the employee's view, asking open questions about what has taken place. So an example is to say, can you tell me a bit about how you're providing the written reports? Might land better than saying, why are your reports late and poorly presented? It's an open question. That's better than a closed sort of critical question. Keep the judgment out of your inquiries. Create a dynamic where the employee is comfortable sharing what's going on. You may need to follow up with exploring reasonable adjustments, which of course is a legal duty under the Equality Act, and potentially professional medical support if that's something that also would be deemed or thought to be a reasonable adjustment in the circumstances.
That's really interesting. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to ask you a question based on that because you've kind of sparked an idea in my head and I want to understand something. So you've talked about there that under the Equality Act, you don't have to have a diagnosis. So when we look at, say, reasonable adjustments and maybe something like access arrangements, how do you feel that concept? So say you were doing an exam or doing a test for something, the Equality Act is saying you don't need that diagnosis, but then other organisations are saying that you do need that evidence. How do you feel that fits? And it's an open question rather than an actual answer. And it came to my head and thinking, well, if in the workplace we're saying to people you don't need to get diagnosed, the Equality Act is covering you, but in my other role in the education space, you can't get support unless you've had that diagnosis. And I'm like thinking the Equality Act covers everyone. How does that fit?
Yeah, I think Aaron, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think it's obviously some people will be happy to volunteer that they are neurodiverse, and they will have had they would have had some medical support and be able to and that diagnosis, and so that's fine. There's such a spectrum because other people won't even know, it won't even occur to them, although maybe to an outside party it might sort of be obvious or suggested that they are neurodiverse. But I think from the employer's point of view, I mean, employers are under duty to sort of look out for these sorts of issues. And if it is fairly obvious that someone is struggling and that might present itself as a neurodiversity, then they would be expected under an obligation to sort of proceed on that basis. But in terms of the definition under the Equality Act, I mean, a disability is defined under the Equality Act, and but it is peculiar to that piece of legislation. And so it doesn't necessarily fit with what a purely medical diagnosis might be. And also, I know from speaking to many neurodiverse people that sometimes they're sensitive about being described as being disabled. But I think the thing to remember is maybe not in the sort of common way that one uses that sort of that word outside of this Equality Act, because that might be very different to how it is defined under the Equality Act. And of course, the Equality Act, it's quite a broad church, the definition, to be honest. And it's something that is broad so as to maximise the number of people that can gain protection under the Equality Act.
Yeah, which I think is really interesting, because I've had people that are, say they're dyslexic and say they're not disabled, but it's probably actually society that actually gives them that makes them disabled, because we like live in a literal world and things like that. But actually, to get that support under the Equality Act, theoretically you have that concept, but it isn't the same connotation. No, it fascinates me. I love listening to people that think the same way that I do about things, so it's brilliant. So I'm going to go back to your questions now, and it says that you mentioned the Equality Act. Can you explain a bit more about how that is relevant to neurodiversity? You've done a little bit there, but if you want to give a bit more of that definition.
Yeah, sure. So under the Equality Act, the actual definition of a disability, or someone who is considered disabled, is if they have a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to undertake day-to-day activities. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful. I'll just sort of break it down a bit. So long-term means either it has lasted for at least a year, or it's expected to last for more than a year. Substantial adverse effect means more than minor, but it may fluctuate or change and may not be present all the time. So, for instance, the adverse effects may manifest themselves in certain social situations, or when an employee is placed under stress or change. So that's substantial adverse effect. And then normal day-to-day activities. In employment, that means interacting with colleagues, using a computer, writing, following instructions, concentrating, and keeping to a timetable. Those are the sorts of examples. So, as long as you can show that the effects of your neurodiversity are such that, clearly long-term, that's an easy box to tick. Substantial, more than minor, that's a fairly easy box to tick, and has an effect on normal day-to-day activities. And of course, many of the neurodiversity things that I have highlighted, diagnoses that I've highlighted, are ones that do affect lots of those examples that I've given about workplace sort of issues. So,
It's fascinating. Well, sorry, I probably cut you off there, because I'm like, this just makes me smile and go, you know what, this is what I talk about a lot, and yes, I work a lot within education. I work within the workplace, and you get people go, and I say, just be knowledgeable, understand your rights as a human. It is, and I will tell you a very quick story about my bank. I get annoyed very much with banks. I'm not going to name the bank because I don't think that's fair, but they changed my mortgage, which I knew they were going to do. They sent it in a letter. We had a phone call about it, so it was, in my opinion, that was a reasonable adjustment enough. And they sent me this letter that said that I had 3 accounts. Had no idea that I had 3 accounts on my mortgage, and it said on the top in the graph, it said product number. And it said the word product number, and I went, okay. And it said that one account had been changed, the rate had gone down, and the other 2, the rate had gone up. And I was like, that's not right, that's not what I remember. And this bit of paper was literally a photocopied bit of paper, one that was sent to everyone that had that product. And what I found out is that product number was a date. And I went, it's not a date. There's no dots, there's no slashes, there's no hyphens, and it wasn't done. So the bank didn't uphold the complaint as basically saying that it wasn't written in a format that someone with neurodiversity could read. It had to go to the financial ombudsman, and it won. And basically now, all three of my accounts are the same rate, because basically one was higher. And I was like saying, it's not accessible enough. You can't put the word product number when you've clearly told me it's a date. It's the wrong terminology. So it's knowledgeable is how it is, and being reasonable. And I think you were reasonable to one point, but then if you change stuff, that's what gets me. That's the hardest thing of being neurodiverse, I think.
Yes.
So carrying on about the Equality Act, you said, so neurodiverse employees are covered by the Act. What rights does that mean? So this is, again, talking about that knowledge. What rights does that cover them? So at work.
Sure.
Maybe.
Well, yeah, of course. So yeah, within the context of work, if an employee has a disability, and for the most part, neurodiverse population would be deemed to fall within that definition within the Equality Act. Where you have an employee who has disability under the Equality Act, you must not treat that employee less favourably because of their disability. So an example of this would be of sort of direct discrimination would be where you fail to promote someone because they're ADHD. So you think, oh, well, they're not even in the running. So that's one level of protection. Also, that you must not treat the employee unfavourably for any reason arising from their disability. So the way that their sort of disability or their neurodiversity manifests itself, unless that is utterly justified. This is the sort of more common but more difficult limb of discrimination that often arises in the context of neurodiverse employees. An example would be if you're disciplining an employee with autism for being dismissive with a client, where that difficulty with communication is a result of challenges with social communication that autistic employee has, and which arise from their neurodiversity. So you have to be very careful, because if they have difficulties with the social interaction, that's obviously something that arises as a consequence of their autism, as a consequence of their disability. So they shouldn't be treated less favourably. And then lastly, the third layer of protection is you mustn't subject the employee to any harassment, victimization, or unjustified indirect discrimination. So an example of that would be teasing, banter, making jokes about someone's neurodiversity, which they find offensive. And it's also worth noting that there's also a concept of what's called associative discrimination. So even if you're not making a joke about the person you're speaking to, but you're making jokes about, say, diverse employees or diverse or neurodiverse people generally. If someone hears that and say they have a child or a husband or a wife or partner who is neurodiverse, they find that insulting, then they are protected as well by association. So they don't actually need to be neurodiverse themselves to be protected under that associative discrimination protection there. So probably the most significant obligation on employers is the duty to make reasonable adjustments, of course, to help neurodiverse carry out their jobs without being at a disadvantage. And that's something that obviously all employers should be on the lookout to see and to inquire and to be curious once they identify someone, if they haven't volunteered the information, but if they feel that someone probably is neurodiverse, then being curious as to what adjustments that can be put in place just to make life easier for them.
No, I think that's the thing. So going on that basis, so what do you think about the understanding of reasonable adjustments? So the context in physical difference, but also, is it harder to understand when it comes to hidden disabilities? What should that company or that employee consider?
Yeah. Well, the Equality Act imposes this duty to make reasonable adjustments to premises or working practices to help disabled employees and also job applicants, so before they've actually become employees. A failure to comply with that duty to make reasonable adjustments is a form of discrimination. So although much depends on an individual situation, things like providing additional support and assistance, counselling, cognitive behaviour therapy, flexibility, for example, in working hours or duties, as well as considering what tasks the employee can do and which might be assigned elsewhere. Those are sorts of things that would all be regarded as reasonable adjustments. An employer should explore what coping mechanisms will help the employee and how the organisation can support these. In some circumstances, especially where the work environment has contributed to the condition or issues, an employer might be expected to pay for additional private health support, for instance. So whether an adjustment is reasonable to make in the circumstances will depend on matters such as whether it will have ameliorated the disabled person's disadvantage, the cost of the adjustment in the light of the employer's financial resources, and the disruption that the adjustment might have on the employer's activities. So there's a sort of balancing act there. However, an employee does need to show that the reasonable adjustment proposed would be effective to avoid the disadvantage that they're suffering. In other words, they need to show that there is a chance that the adjustment will be successful, that there's a prospect of success. And with regard to impact, the adjustment does not need to be completely effective or to remove all the disadvantage to be a reasonable adjustment, but it just needs to be shown that it's likely to have a positive impact on that neurodiverse employee.
It is really interesting, again, for me to think about it and how I, as a severely dyslexic adult that finds reading difficult. Yes, I can read, I can decode, but when I'm in a certain situation, and I was on this a few weeks ago, where I was on a live chat on a website trying to get something completed, and all I wanted to do was talk to someone, and the person in the chat was trying to tell me, you need to change this to do it. And I was like, but if I change that, or if I do that, I don't know what's going to happen next. And I couldn't type it and explain it. I couldn't dictate it, and it was really thing. So I raised a complaint about it, that it wasn't accessible. And yes, the company didn't change their policy around their phone system and having a phone system. They carried on doing that, but they actually listened. And to me, that was more reasonable, that we did actually have a conversation with someone, with an advisor later on, just to explain where we were. And I think that's the thing. The word reasonable is kind of interesting, because, like, going on to your next question, we've got here, it says there, so you seem there's quite a lot of duties that the employee's got to do. Can you give us some ideas of what adjustments might not be reasonable?
Sure. Well, I'm going to do that by reference to a sort of recent case that went through the employment system and employment tribunal system, and then went up to the employment appeal tribunal. This involved an agoraphobic employee to work from home. So they would ostensibly be arguing that was a reasonable adjustment, but the Employment Appeal Tribunal held that it was wrong for the earlier tribunal that heard the first level case. It held that it was wrong that tribunal had focused on the employer's failure to agree that request without first considering whether the adjustment would have been futile. And the evidence showed that the work that the employee was doing involved face-to-face interviews with the public and handling confidential files to other employees in the office who needed access to those confidential files, and that just couldn't be done effectively from home. Also, the employer in question had considered alternative work at a more senior level, which wouldn't involve such responsibilities and could ostensibly be done at home, but apparently no such work was available. So the focus was, well, okay, the employer's saying it was a reasonable adjustment to work from home, but actually, they basically wouldn't have been able to do their job. So that wasn't held to be a reasonable adjustment in the circumstances. So I think what it shows is that employers are not expected to accommodate every request. There has to be some prospect that adjustment is likely to have some sort of positive impact and will support the employee in continuing to do the work that they're contracted to do. And in some circumstances, home-based or avoid dealing with the public will be fundamentally incompatible with the person's role. In others, it won't be. It'll be absolutely fine. But it is a case of sort of focusing down on the role in question and whether those adjustments still mean that they can actually do their role. So so that would be the most obvious example. And I think the other thing I was just going to say as well was that an area where reasonable adjustments are often overlooked is when running a performance or disciplinary or other management process. And of course, these sort of processes can be very difficult for neurodiverse employees. And that's really where you're going to be, as an employer, under pressure to make reasonable adjustments to remove any hurdles in those sorts of management processes.
It is interesting that you're saying that, because like just explaining that to me, it's like there's a bit of logic in it, and I think that's the other thing about it is you've got to both make that decision of what's reasonable, and in certain situations when you are neurodiverse, you're under a lot of stress, you're under a lot of pressure because that's how you are. So actually, at the time when when that issue is causing an issue and you need that reasonable adjustment there and then, you may go, actually, I really need it. It's fully reasonable. But then if you reflect and go, you know what, actually, that concept is not reasonable. So no, I think it really highlights that actually that the Equality Act is there. It's not always a negative thing for the employer, rather than but it's also is a positive thing for the employee as well. So no, so it is really interesting. So could you say a bit more about about adjustments to management processes?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because I think an employer should definitely be under a duty or be prepared to adjust management processes when subjecting neurodiverse employees to those processes. Performance and conduct issues need to be addressed, but an employer might be expected to modify those sorts of processes. For instance, ordinarily in disciplinary and performance processes, you're under the sort of legal regulations. You're allowed to be accompanied, but only by a fellow employee or a trade union rep. But now you might want to flex that for a neurodiverse employee who maybe would just find it just a bit easier to have, say, a family member or someone that's outside those sort of regulated companions. So that would be an obvious one, and that's what you do see that quite a lot. Or where someone is in one of those processes, allowing them additional time to answer questions and to be interviewed. Also, I think when you've got a disciplinary investigation, employers should be careful to avoid creating a vicious circle in which the investigation triggers or exacerbates neurodiverse challenges and interferes with the employee's ability to progress in investigation. I think often when action is needed to address the concerns and the adjustments that will enable the employer to complete the investigation, hopefully to achieve the best outcome for all. So, for instance, if you've got an autistic employee who's subjected to a disciplinary, they might find it easier or more comfortable to do it by way of written submissions rather than face-to-face interactions. Or an employee with ADHD, and a reasonable adjustment in that context might be to give frequent sort of breaks during meetings so that they can get up and move around. A dyslexic employee may request a recording of meetings rather than a transcript. And of course, none of these sorts of changes are difficult for an employer to comply with, but these are the sorts of things that, certainly when I'm advising companies that are putting neurodiverse people through these sorts of processes, that these are the sort of adjustments that I would suggest that they think about and make.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned recording of meetings, as in a previous employer I had a device that would record my handwritten notes and record the sound that was going on in the meeting, and we had a very difficult meeting where we were going through a change in leadership. And as I know, as someone that's neurodiverse, that is for my use. It's not for distribution. It's for me to use because that's what's covered under the Equality Act. They were not happy, and I was forced to delete it and by other employees. And it sticks in my mind that organisation is meant to be and is probably more aware of this situation, and there was when the new leadership came in, that was told to everyone that should never happen. It will never happen again, because it's not right. And so it's interesting how you said that, because I think it's an area that some people that are not neurodiverse and not understand how that actually is really helpful. They can find it a bit like daunting that they can record, but it's all about that personal use, and what they're using it for is quite important. So you've talked a lot about the challenges faced by neurodiverse employees, but as you said, it's easier and often expected of what good they can do. Could you talk a bit more about the values of having neurodiverse employees in a business or in a company?
Yeah, of course, and yeah, this is one of the reasons why I feel so passionately about the area, because neurodiverse individuals think differently, and it's the whole diversity of thought that can bring such amazing sort of innovation, creativity, hyper specialism to business. And these abilities are underused in some industries. In others, for instance, I very much, my practice is very much focused on the tech sector, and the tech sector actually probably have the much more than average number of neurodiverse employees in their workforce, because the roles sort of play to their strengths, and they seem to have got on board with the fantastic things that neurodiverse employees can bring much earlier than other business sectors. They're really good at providing an inclusive and flexible environment in which neurodiverse employees can do their best work. And a number of my tech clients have forums, coaching and training to specifically support neurodiverse employees and their managers. So there's this whole sort of system in place that A, they want to attract neurodiverse into the business, and B, they've got a system in place to support and make sure that they can do their best work. And my experience of working with employers is that raising awareness among managers and the general workforce reduces the number of grievances and performance issues generated, because it just gives neurodiverse employees the confidence to share their difficulties, and also gives managers the understanding to explore what adjustments and support can be put in place before things suddenly go off a tangent and become too difficult or to deal with, and to sort of somehow get to some sort of happy place between the employer and the employee. Small changes like just conveying how instructions are given, how reporting is provided, times of work, physical aspects of the work environment, they can all stop issues in their tracks and provide an environment where neurodiverse talent can really flourish. And that's really what it's all about. And that's why I think it's so important to raise awareness about neurodiversity and what businesses and managers and things can do to support.
Yeah, it's encouraging to me. I recently was at an event where a gentleman came up to me and told me about his work that he did. He was an artist. He works in art restoring and alterations for actually more for event publicity. So he works theoretically in the marketing department, but the reason he was employed because of his talented artist. And because of the pandemic, what has happened with him is that their workload was very small, was very negligible, but because more events have been coming up, their workload just tripled overnight theoretically, and that process for the managers to ensure that his work was at that level they wanted it was the communication bit was what was being broken down. So having that conversation, but the encouraging bit was for me is that the managers wanted to have that conversation. They wanted to engage and kind of find ways to support it that was reasonable for everyone. So there is that silver lining, I think, when people really see that talent of what's there. And kind of when we've just listened to our previous talk with Neuropool of what they've done, which is brilliant. So it's really encouraging to hear what you've said, and that there are so far employers who want to get started and supporting and inclusive for their neuro employees. What would you say they need to do first? What would you advise for them to do first?
I'd say there's a whole there's the whole life of someone's career, and I think I'd say a good place to start is at the beginning of the employment relationship with recruitment advertisements. Do they clearly convey or your support of neuro minorities in your business? Are they accessible and in the right medians? Are you offering the right reasonable adjustments to the recruitment process? For example, some neurodiverse candidates perform better in on the sort of job assessments rather than your sort of bog standard interview process, face-to-face interview process. And then, so that's at the recruitment stage. Then once employees have joined the organisation, just consider the ongoing support that can be provided at crucial stages of careers, including promotion, role changes, during any periods of disruption or change, reorganisations, that sort of thing. And as I mentioned, that we're doing at Osborne Clark, having a support forum, neurodiversity champions, and those able to provide guidance and mentoring can also be really helpful. And I think what I'm sure of is if you can create an environment where the neurodiverse can do their best, be their best selves, the benefits to the business are just huge. So it is just a case of just making sure, applying in mind what adjustments can be made all through the sort of the life cycle of the employment relationship.
It is really interesting because we know that positivity is really there, and I think and this is a question that I was just thinking. When we look at from an employer point of view, the employer's point of view, we know that we can see that positivity, we can see that change can really help the employer. It can help with growth, it can help with business goals, but it's also understanding that the negative side of that, because and this is where I may be wrong, and I'm hoping you'll correct me. Am I right in thinking that if ever it did go to an employment tribunal, there is no cap on what it is, where in certain employment tribunals there's caps on amount of money that can be paid out? Am I right to think there's still no cap for disability claims?
Yeah, that's right. So whereas there's a cap for, say, like unfair dismissal for any form of discrimination, it's uncapped, but that's sort of not quite the end of the story, because the tribunals will only tend to make an award that they feel is sufficient to compensate that employee for their loss of their future rights. So the way that while in theory it's uncapped, the tribunal will turn its mind to asking how long that employee is likely to be out of work, how long will it take them to get a job at a sort of commensurate salary and package. And employees aren't allowed to just sort of sit on their hands. They have to show that they've taken steps to mitigate their losses, to find alternative employment. So ordinarily, particularly in sort of the pandemic times, the tribunals will normally sort of start from, if the employee has made reasonable attempts, still hasn't got a job, from maybe compensating between sort of 1 to 2 years salary. But as I say, if someone's working in a business, a business sector that is just incredibly busy, and the reality is that they are definitely going to find another job within, say, 3 months, so their only losses as a consequence of leaving the previous company is 3 months loss of income, then that's what they get. But depending on people's ages and where they work and the sectors and their job opportunities, of course, it could potentially be open-ended. It all just really is very fact specific.
Yeah, no. It's fascinating. I think it's been amazing listening to you. The questions that we've read out and some of the things I've added in are brilliant. There has been a lot of comments on the chat. I'm just looking through them. I think the one thing I'm going to finish with, this is a really good question. It's just a kind of a resource kind of question. Do you know of any kind of criteria for assessing reasonable adjustments? I thought it was quite an interesting question.
Yeah, that is. I mean, I think it's one of those things that yeah, of course there's going to be sort of guidance and things like that, but I think it's an area where it's really, really important to consult with the individual employee themselves, because it's all, when we're talking about neurodiverse people, one autistic person won't be the same as another, and it's shades of grey and differences, and so I think that the most important message is that you consult with the individual. You might have a vague idea about the sort of adjustments you think might be appropriate for that particular person with that particular type of neurodiversity. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to really be about what they feel might make a difference to them. And so I think it's that personal piece, that personal discussion with them that is just like so highly important in trying to get something that will be effective and will work for that particular person and the particular neurodiversity that they have.
No, that's most appreciated, Danielle. I think it's been an amazing conversation with you. I think I could talk for you for another half an hour to another hour about this, but I'm looking at the time and we're 5 minutes over already, so I'm going to let's bring this to a close. Thank you so much for listening.